And with that small administrative note, it is now my pleasure to introduce someone I've known for a good while at this point, James Tauber, and he's going to be talking about literate programming in tutorial land.
Thank you very much, Eric. I'm going to do something a little unusual for me in that I'm not going to use slides at all, which seems appropriate given this is called Write the Docs. It's not called Write the Slides, so I didn't. So we'll see how this goes. It was good enough for Matt yesterday. I'm in the unenviable position, yes, I can say that word too, Daniel. I'm in the unenviable position of following the last two speakers, which both of which were phenomenal. This talk, I think, is going to quite literally be prosaic in comparison to the last one in particular. What I want to talk about is sort of a combination of ideas around literate programming and version control that might be applicable in the writing of tutorials. This is going to be somewhat of a Socratic talk in as much as I'm going to be posing more questions than answers, but hopefully it'll still be of interest to people. So my name's James Tauber. I've been doing open source for about 20 years. Did 12 years of Java, but my true love is Python, which I've been doing for the last 15 years. A bunch of my stuff's on GitHub. You can follow me on Twitter there, jtauber. I am the CEO and founder of a company called Eldarian, which builds websites in Django and Python. We have a hosting platform called Gondor. We also build a bunch of other sites, a habit tracker called Habitualist. Looks like the images aren't coming through, oddly. Hopefully that won't be a problem for later on. A flashcard program called Exposition, and a bunch of other things as well. I'm also involved with edX, helping them to open source their MOOC platform. So this talk is going to touch on literate programming. It's not going to go into a huge amount of detail about literate programming. The next talk following mine is going to be a lot more about literate programming. But before we even get into any of that, of course, literate programming needs a mascot. And given that documentation, we've decided we're adopting this mascot of the sloth. I thought it would be appropriate that the mascot for literate programming would be a literate sloth. Yes, there are actually Google hits for sloth reading a book. So I'm going to talk, as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about a particular kind of documentation, the tutorial, and a particular kind of tutorial. The tutorial you often get that's a step-by-step building up of some code, a running code project, maybe showing how to use a particular library or framework, explaining how a particular concept might be implemented in a language, or maybe a description of how a particular program was developed by step by step in the first place. So as I mentioned, this is not a talk where I'm going to provide a lot of answers. I'm not going to be demoing an existing tool or open source project or anything. It's more about an idea that will hopefully lead to a tool or a discovery that a tool already exists. I'm looking forward to Anna Nelson's talk this afternoon. I'm hoping that may be able to help out with some of this. So this talk is what scholars called a prolegomenon. It's a Greek word that means that the things said beforehand, sort of lay a foundation, set a scope, define some terms before you actually get into the detail. So my goal for this talk is mostly to get you thinking, to get you discussing afterwards, and maybe even to get you coding. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the history of my thinking around this. We'll do a bit of a chronological tour of some various things that I've written that led to this idea of how we might be able to combine the idea of literate programming with version control to build these sorts of tutorials. So you don't have to worry about the details of any of the code I'm showing, but about 10 years ago, I posted to the Python list, it was June 2003, this example. I'm trained as a linguist like Noreen, and I wanted to sort of develop this notion of how this concept in linguistics called feature structures could be implemented in Python. And you don't need to worry about the details other than the fact that what I posted to the mailing list was this sort of combination of text explaining what I was doing with fragments of Python code interspersed. There's a couple of things that I want to point out about this. First of all, it's got this sort of very narrative feel to it, where I'm describing, what we might do next. But importantly, this is actually executable. This is just a Python script. I've used comments in the middle to build that narrative around what I'm doing. It's not quite literate programming in the way that Don Knuth envisaged it. So maybe we could coin the term narrative programming or something like that. But the idea is that there's very much this sequence of ideas as we're building up the code. Now, Don Knuth, back in '84, when he coined the term literate programming, his sort of vision was described in the paper he wrote. He said, let's change our traditional attitude to the construction of programs. Instead of imagining that our main task is to instruct a computer what to do, let us concentrate rather on explaining to human beings what we want a computer to do. So this isn't, as I said, a literate program in the sense of the system that Don Knuth built. It's just a commented Python script, but it's still trying to embrace some of that notion that Don was talking about. There's a couple of other things I'll point out, mostly for the people who know Python. There's a bunch of sort of testing whether what I'm talking about actually works, spread throughout in the form of these asserts. There's also, this is non-monotonic in the sense that I'm actually changing the definition of some things as I go. I define an FS4 and an FS5 here, and then later on you'll see I actually redefine them. And I think that's actually an important part of the kind of tutorial building that I'm talking about, that you do sometimes need to define something one way and then go back and say, you know what, we're going to actually define it a different way. Another example, just to sort of motivate this sort of stuff I'm talking about. This is another post that I sent to a mailing list back in 2003. This was actually to the Web Special Interest Group for Python. And I was just playing around with some various ways that you could potentially build a templating language. And again, you don't need to worry about the details of the Python. It's more this flavor of this sort of narrative approach where I'm discussing what's being done, building up code bit by bit. So this is also narrative. It's executable. It's just a Python script. This is a little different in that I didn't have tests. I just have these print statements, and I'm not actually showing in this document what the results would be. You can't see it because it's not wide enough, but let me reduce the font size a bit. I manually added these 3 hashes at the side where a line had changed. So this was a very manual process. This wasn't constructed at all by any tool. This has the same non-monotonic characteristic. But you get the sense with this one that it's a lot more step-by-step, and you get the sense that this could actually be broken up into separate files. So these two examples aren't unlike what I was originally saying about one of the possible uses for this kind of stuff. These aren't tutorials on how to build how to use an existing system. They're actually step-by-step developments of a particular idea in code. But I think the application applies in both cases. There's still sort of this attempt to write in a narrative fashion that conforms, at least in part, to Knuth's vision. What really got me thinking about this, though, was something that I worked on the following year. In 2004, I was the CTO of a company that was building a rich client for DevOps to use, and it was built on Eclipse. Many of you may be familiar with Eclipse as an IDE, but Eclipse is actually a very rich, extensible framework for building IDEs, and that's what we were using. And one of the things that was being worked on within the Eclipse project was something called the graphical editing framework. And it was a sort of thing that you could actually build Visio or OmniGraffle with. Now, bearing in mind that at least one of the original Design Patterns Gang of 4 members was one of the creators of Eclipse. Eclipse has this very design pattern heavy, highly extensible architecture. Forget model view controllers. This graphical editing framework had models, parts, figures, policies, commands. It was a huge amount of decoupling, a lot of extensible hooks. It was quite difficult to get a basic application up and running, but once you had that up and running, it was quite easy to sort of plug new pieces into. Now, at the time, the examples that were on the site that explained the graphical editing framework, they were great examples, but they were a little too advanced for kind of learning the basic principles of how you construct an application. So I built a sort of minimal application using the graphical editing framework, and I basically snapshotted it at six points along the way. You can't really see particularly well here, but basically the way that I did it was I had 6 separate folders. At each point they were runnable. Some of the snapshots were somewhat revisionist in that maybe at step 5 I realized that there was a better way of doing step 2, so I had to go back and change step 2. So there's a sense in which it's sort of almost a fake version history here. But you can see the connection with version control. That I basically snapshotted various versions of this program, and you can look, you don't need to again worry about the details of the code, but here's an example where I've got a particular file in version 1 and a particular file in version 2. As I'm adding functionality, there's things being added to files, there's new files being created. Now, there's no easy way here to see what was added in each step or why. You can diff versions. I could do a diff between version 1 and version 2. It's not particularly helpful just to do this diffing. It's got this sense of versioning that the other 2 examples I gave didn't have, but it's lost a lot of that literate quality. But there's a kernel of an idea here, and I actually wrote a blog post shortly after this, where I basically said that I've been thinking about turning this into a tutorial, and I wondered what role literate programming would have in this. The idea was that I could, to use terms from literate programming, I could write a web and then tangle it to generate the application and weave it to get the tutorial. But because features are added incrementally to the application over the course of the tutorial, conventional literate programming might not be enough. At the very least, some kind of versioning would need to be included. So I started playing around with various ideas of how we might be able to combine these notions of version control and literate programming. So I went back in 2006 and revisited my template tutorial, the second thing I showed you. And I put each step in its own file. So there were standalone snapshots runnable at each stage. And this time, instead of the documentation being comments, there's actually an HTML file that references the individual Python files. So I sort of had this skeleton where I would talk about stuff, and this is a very, very simple markup language. If a line started with 2 hashes, it meant go pull the Python file with that name, and syntax color highlight it, so you see examples of the individual files here. It's a very, very simple approach, but it enabled me to check that the code was executable at every stage. There were times when I had to make references to earlier steps, so I was doing things like importing. So this isn't perfect in terms of capturing that notion of step-by-step development. So it's still not traditional literate programming. It's still not really taking advantage of a version control system, though. And that's sort of where my thinking has headed since then, how we might actually be able to combine things. I'm going to skip over, actually, another example just in the interest of time. If we do have time at the end, I can still show it. So just looking back, in the GEF examples, the graphical editor framework, we had snapshots, but there wasn't really any documentation showing how we got from each step to the next. Now, you could model that, each snapshot as a commit to a version control system. That seems a reasonable thing to do. And then maybe the commit message could be the documentation of how we went from one step to the next. There's problems with that, though, that we don't really want to document the whole change. We want to comment on finer-grained changes. So, maybe we can take advantage of something like what GitHub offers with its per-line comments, but, extended to larger chunks. Maybe we want smaller commits, where we're documenting just small changes that are being made. The problem there is that the overall tutorial might not be executable at every single commit point. So we want to use something like branches to group the commits into larger groups. But there's an even bigger problem with trying to just use a version control system for managing the steps of a tutorial, which is how do we handle this sort of revisionist history that we're doing? How do we distinguish between the history that we're wanting to convey to the tutorial reader from the fact that we're just also versioning our tutorial? If we go back and change our minds about step 1, that's sort of a new version of step 1, but it's a different sense of version than the difference between step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. The template approach that I showed decoupled the tutorial from the code by treating the tutorial as a kind of layer over the snapshots of code. So one of the things that I'm starting to explore is what if the markup language could refer not to files, but to individual commits, individual collections of lines within those commits. Be able to diff between branches or line-based subsets of diffs or commits. Maybe tags would be better to use than branches. Although one potential benefit of using branching is that if you've written this 10-step tutorial and you go back and want to change the way something was done in step 3, you actually want that to ripple forward to all the subsequent versions, and that's something that a version control system, if you're taking advantage of the branching support in the version control system, might be able to help with. The other issue is that diffs aren't really the best way of showing what's changing from step to step. In particular, if you're changing, say, a method in a class, you typically don't really want to show the diff in a tutorial. You just want to show the new method. People can always look earlier up in the tutorial to see what it once was, but in many cases you just want to show what you're replacing rather than an actual line-by-line diff. So just to sort of wrap up, make sure we have time for some questions. No one path seems the obvious one to follow next. Anytime I've tried to do something clever with Git branches or rewriting history with interactive rebasing and stuff like that, I've always hit a wall. It was funny, I posted to Stack Overflow a bunch of questions about this, phrased just as questions about how you might do certain things in Git, and I actually got accused of trying to get help with my homework. I don't know how you convince someone that that's not what you're trying to do, but anyway. My next sort of thinking, and I'm certainly hoping to get ideas from people, but I do want to explore more of this notion of taking the template example and having markup that is able to refer to particular commits or particular branches. The other thing that I think it's important to note is that these tutorials that I've been talking about aren't just about introducing the reader. In most of the examples that I showed, it was also actually an exploration for the writer, the steps that I went through as a developer trying to build this stuff. And I think that's important because literate programming isn't just about reading, it's also about the process of writing too. Knuth's original paper didn't describe literate programming as a new way to do documentation so much as a new way of writing programs. So I think in many regards, even though it's not traditional literate programming, I still somehow need to work out a way of combining the world of version control with the world of literate programming. I do think that what I'm trying to do here is really getting to the heart of Knuth's vision for literate programming, which is that writing the code and writing the documents describing that code should actually be the same thing. And with that, I will end and open up for any questions. I can't see a thing, so...
Yeah. Well, I'm going to steal the mic and ask the first question.
Yep.
So one of the kind of running themes has been about empathy, and you kind of touched on this at the end, where part of this was kind of, it's not just for the user reading the documentation, but they can actually see a little bit more into like the workflow and the thought process kind of the person writing the tutorial or kind of doing the work. So do you think this is like a way that you could kind of convey a more empathetic kind of reality to your users where they're like, oh, look, he screwed up writing the tutorial.
Right.
I can screw up running the tutorial, and something, kind of along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think there's pedagogical value to saying, let's try this. Oh, it didn't work, so let's try that. I think in a lot of cases that can be useful. I wouldn't necessarily, coming back to this whole issue of there being two revision histories going on, I think you wouldn't necessarily want to show exactly the steps that were followed, because you're always going to do things, make mistakes, typos and stuff. They're just going to distract people. So I think it's important that you're building this revision history with the goal of better conveying the sort of actual thought process. But absolutely, I think it's potentially very helpful to show people what the thinking was that you went through to get where you got to.
Next question.
This is sort of a comment, I guess, but I was really interested to see this because I faced a similar problem preparing my PyCon tutorial.
Yep.
And I noted that Sphinx has a literal include directive. And so what I did was I used two different Git repositories, one for the tutorial text and one for the sample code, and then built a Sphinx extension that would check out particular branch names. So we kind of arrived at similar conclusions here, but particular branch names. And what I found was that if you check that out, the subsequent literal include directives would pull, there's just a few little tweaks to make them actually work, so you could actually get different points in time and be able to pull in that. So it's still not a single source, but it at least lets you sort of weave them together in a way that is helpful.
That sounds very much in line with. Sorry. So is this extension available for others, or is it still?
It is cunningly named Tut, as in tutorial, and Sphinx and hieroglyphs, that kind of thing. So yes, it's
excellent.
on PyPy.
I'll definitely check that out, because that sounds very much in line with the kind of thing.
Sure.
Next question.
I can't see it all up there to know if people are putting their hand. I'll rely on others to.
Upstairs? Yep, I see one. Here I come. You want to yell? Okay, we'll repeat the question.
Step that the code compile?
I think it's worthwhile having, certainly in all the projects that I was doing here, especially the GEF one, I think it's useful for a user to be able to stop the tutorial at any point and see what it looks like at that point, and preferably run it. There may be, I guess there's an argument that could be made that you could have a compromise where you specifically mark the stages at which it should be runnable, and maybe there are some steps that are partial that it's not going to be runnable at. But I think the key thing is having those points where you can say, click here to actually look at everything so far and be able to execute that. And to do that in a way that you're not doing all this extra work. I mean, the whole point of this is how can we build a system that lets you offer that functionality to the reader without doing it as part of a normal, the normal process of developing and documenting code.
Any more questions? No. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
Never mind. There was one more.
Oh.
Sorry, I was bad at seeing that.
So I guess I'm kind of curious about potentially using Git branches to create different tutorials for users as they become more advanced. Mm-hmm. Have you considered that at all? Or can you think about how that would work?
Yeah, I mean, the problem I always found with trying to using Git natively like that has lots of advantages in terms of being able to cherry pick stuff between, but you do run into this problem that there's a lot of, you need to be able to rewrite history, and you can get into trouble very quickly doing that because you're wanting to sort of, I guess, pave over mistakes and wrong directions you went to. But certainly, I mean, I think that's this notion of snapshotting different versions doesn't necessarily need to just be about step 1, step 2, step 3. You could absolutely do it for sort of, this is the simple version, this is the more intermediate version, this is the more advanced version of the code, absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.